All right, guys, I'm gonna get started here. Any questions on any of the material up to date? Anything you've seen? No? All right, so the next three chapters, including this one, chapter 9, deal with market structures and deal with the whole analysis of how different firms determine what price to charge in different industries. The thing that we have to keep in mind is that it's not you who decides, I'm going to start a restaurant or I'm going to start a clothing brand or whatever, what industry you're going to be in. It's the different characteristics of the industry that you're in that determine whether you are something that resembles perfect competition, something that resembles a monopoly, something that resembles monopolistic competition, or oligopoly. So depending on the characteristics involved, you're going to be in one of those four categories. The limiting factor, the simplifying factor that's common to all for this specific class is we talk about this concept of perfect information. / knowledge. Okay. So in the four characteristics of each of the four market structures, we're going to assume this one here for this class. But if ever you were to do more advanced economics classes, we would no longer necessarily assume that. And what this serves, this kind of purpose, what it serves is that it means that consumers know everything that's available. And businesses know like consumers' willingness to pay and demand curves and everything else. So the curves, the way we're going to represent reality, that is known by everyone. So it's a simplifying assumption. In reality, it's not quite the case, but it's a simplifying assumption that helps us get a lot of points across without necessarily getting into more complicated math and modeling and everything else. But at a more advanced level, we wouldn't have this perfect information / knowledge attribute. Then the three other big pillars that will help you determine whether you're in one of the four market structures depends on the, first off, the amount of sellers. Okay. So we're going to split the amount of sellers into kind of three big categories. In reality, it doesn't really have to be as clear cut, but I'll give you guys a bit of an idea here. So you could either have an infinite amount of sellers, that's just a lazy way of writing an infinite by showing the infinity symbol, an infinite amount of sellers. You could have a few amount of sellers, or you can have one. Okay. Then afterwards, you could talk about not barriers to entry, but here types of goods. So it's either perfectly identical goods or differentiated goods. So I'll just write identical or differentiated. So identical goods or differentiated goods. So this one will really help to serve and split this few category. It's going to either have few category with identical goods or differentiated goods. When we're going to talk about an infinite amount of sellers, we're going to be talking about an infinite amount of sellers selling identical goods. And when we talk about only one firm producing goods, well then this is irrelevant. We're not really talking about identical or differentiated goods. They're the only goods. We're not comparing goods of different producers, different sellers. We have one producer / seller for all of these goods. And the reason why we only have one seller is kind of like the third kind of big category, which talks about barriers to entry. The reason why we only have one seller typically is due to barriers to entry. In this case here, we'll associate it to this case. Whereas in these three other cases here, there is no barriers to entry. Okay, so here, so if I think about this one here with only one seller because of barriers to entry, here we're talking about a monopoly. When we have an infinite amount of sellers that are selling identical products, we're talking about perfect competition. And then the two kinds of imperfect competition here are, if we have an identical good, we're going to be talking about an oligopoly. And if we have differentiated goods, we're going to be talking about monopolistic competition. And as I mentioned, these three here have no real barriers to entry. Companies will try to block you from coming in, but it won't be as easy as monopoly. And we'll see how barriers to entry work in a monopoly. Okay. So, today, our focus of this class today is talking about perfect competition, which is an extreme scenario. The three other kind of market structures that we're going to see in this class, I wouldn't say are necessarily more common, but they're not as limiting in terms of assumptions. Having a monopoly, having only one seller of a specific good, it doesn't need to mean that this is the only person producing this product. But if ever you go to a concert or you go to a hockey game in Montreal, well, in that location, if you want to buy a drink or you want to buy food, you're kind of limited. Like, I can't just show up there and decide to start selling beer to any other people there. There is a certain monopoly power on who can sell, rightfully, beer on location, legally. Same thing here on campus. Like, you might find different small ways to bypass, but generally speaking, Sodexo controls food and beverages on campus. If I want to throw an event, an evening event with a guest speaker, and I want food to be available there, I have to go through Sodexo. That is a monopoly. That has monopoly power. If you're the only one producing a certain type of good, then you also have monopoly power. We'll talk more about monopoly next week when we get into the monopoly chapter, but that's pretty common. It's pretty easy to understand. And then the two kind of few sellers here, identical products. Oligopoly is situations such as gas stations where you're pretty much dealing with identical products. Gas at Petro-Canada versus Esso is seen as pretty much identical. However, if one person drops their price, they're going to have an influence on their sales, but also other people's sales. So there's a certain level of market power, we would say. And differentiated products are what we're commonly seeing. If you're thinking about buying a new phone, buying clothing, buying a car, buying a desk, buying just about anything where you have a certain level of branding, that would be monopolistic competition, a differentiated product. I prefer this brand to this brand for these reasons. The quality of this wood or this paint is better than this wood or this paint. It's a differentiated product, toothpaste, whatever you want. So a lot of products fall into the differentiated category. And monopoly and perfect competition, you're dealing with a product that is identical, but since you have an infinite amount of sellers, this assumption here that we have that does not exist in the other categories means that what are the implications of this is no seller has market power. What we mean by no seller has market power, you're such a small player in all of the suppliers of this product that if you decide to produce more or less, you're not going to influence the price. You're not going to influence the price of this product. So these situations, we say that firms in this market structure are price takers.
So you said no seller has market?
No seller has market power. Market power, yeah. They are price takers. It's not true that in all industries you're price takers. So I like to highlight all of this because sometimes when we start with this very limiting market structure, some people feel that everything's going to be like far from reality. It's not that far from reality. Even though it's simplified for this class, it still has a lot of value. In all of these categories here, you are not a price taker. Whether you're a gas station, you can decide to charge a little bit less, a little bit more than your competitor that's across the street. When you're releasing a new car, a new phone, a new camera, you can decide to charge whatever price you want. And the people selling beer at the Bell Center or selling food here on campus can charge whatever price they want. So this is the only category that we're seeing as a price taker. But here we're dealing with industries that have an infinite amount of buyers and sellers. So here we're often thinking about such things such as what we call commodities. Commodities can be seen as like raw materials, oil, wheat, whatever else. Okay. That's the kind of category that it's in. I'll just kind of put like an iffy line under oil, and it would be the same thing under wheat. It would have to be a category that is a very standardized product. When you're pumping gasoline into your car from one of the gas stations, you don't know if this gas comes from refined petroleum from Fort McMurray in BC. You don't know if it comes from Saskatchewan. You don't know if it comes from Saudi Arabia. To you, it's all the same. As long as it's a standardized product, it's all the same. So, and same thing as if you were to produce flour, if it comes from a specific farmer in Saskatchewan or Manitoba and you wanted to produce flour, as long as it's a certain standard, you would pay by weight. It's things that are often have like fluctuating values based on the product. You could think of gold, you could think about just about anything. There's a certain world price associated to these products. The reason why I put kind of like an iffy line is in the sense that in reality, these industries may behave slightly different than what we're going to assume here in perfect competition, based on the fact that in the oil industry and some other industries, it's not true that we have a ton of small players, in the sense that we have a ton of small producers producing oil. In reality, we have like some mega companies that are worth like billions of dollars. So they can exert some level of power in the industry. If they decide to produce more or less, if Saudi Arabia decides to cut oil exports, it definitely has major repercussions. If some of these countries or companies decide to flood the market with product, it's going to have an impact because there's a few key players that control a lot of things. But if you were to think about wheat, and you would think that there's a lot of small-scale wheat farmers that bring their wheat to a co-op or whatever else to sell their wheat, and the price of the wheat is based on everyone's kind of input into the wheat market and everyone's kind of small players, then yes, what we're going to see here in perfect competition applies. But at the end of the day, the perfect competition kind of framework is that you're going to have this world price, or we'll call it world price or market price. based on market demand and supply. So, in this class, just to give you guys a bit of a heads up, we're going to see graphs for perfect competition. We're going to see graphs for monopolistic competition that resemble monopoly. We're going to see graph for monopoly as well. We won't see any for oligopoly. It just gets really tricky fast. We'll see a different way of analyzing it. But in all three of these two will have just one graph to analyze the whole picture. This one's always going to be well, not always, but typically seen as a two-graph framework. So I'll just kind of illustrate what I mean by this here. You're going to have a market graph, and you're going to have a typical firm graph. And you try to draw them side by side because the price is on both vertical axes. And whatever price is determined by market supply and demand, this price is the price that this typical firm will face, and we'll see what that's equal to in a second. And for this typical firm, we will add Chapter 7's cost curves, the three main ones. So I'll just draw this out here. I'll just draw one scenario. So I'll draw one scenario here, which is a stable scenario, and I'll illustrate why this is a stable scenario, and just pay attention before you draw it. So marginal cost curve is always the Nike symbol. AVC always intersects at its lowest point. And a stable situation will be that the ATC intersects with MC at its lowest point as usual, but also at that point where it intersects with this kind of like horizontal line at the same time. We say that this is a stable situation. So this is a stable situation because we have zero economic profits. So we'll analyze the stable situation to start. We'll then talk about the differing situations that may occur. And we'll kind of talk about different industries that, even though they're not like perfectly competitive, that could kind of mimic this in a certain way, or go towards this. Okay. Any questions so far?
It's good if you have zero economic profits, right?
It's nor good nor bad. Okay, so that's a very good question to answer here. Zero economic profits. When we talk about economic profits, economic costs, we always take into account your own time cost. So if I'm earning $100,000 a year to teach here at Bishop's, and I were to start my own business, and as I start my own business, I give myself the equivalent salary because I work the same amount of hours as I do here, and so on and so forth. Well, after paying me that time cost of $100,000, if I end up with zero excess profits, would be a situation of zero economic profits. So I'm not losing money by starting in my own business. I'm not worse off from a poverty standpoint or from a richness standpoint, but I'm not better off either. Negative economic profits could be a situation that I quit my job here to start my own business and only earn $40,000 a year. Still making money, but when I consider my time, if I'm working the same amount of hours, then I'm losing in that scenario. And the situation of positive economic profits would be a situation I quit my job here, I work the exact same amount of hours, but I make $300,000 a year. Even though I consider my time, the value of my time, I'm better off making positive economic profits. Okay? So your economic profits, as with your time, depends on who you are. So maybe now as a student, for you to start a business and for it to be worthwhile, you have to earn X amount of money over the summer. But later on, if ever you go and you start being a CEO for a company and you're making like millions, if you were to start a side business and give up your job as a CEO, well, your threshold amount of profits that you have to make, accounting profits, for you to be happy, all depends on your time value. Okay? But for me, the way I kind of describe a situation of positive economic profits is as if you were to start a lemonade stand here on campus. It doesn't really work as well when it's snowing. And you would be driving around in a Lamborghini because you're making like $500,000 a year. Like that's obviously a desirable situation. So positive economic profits is always better than zero economic profits, but zero economic profits is not a bad situation. And it's seen as a stable situation. Why do we say that this is a stable situation? Is that there is no incentive to enter or exit this industry. So we talked earlier about barriers to entry, and we said that it's only in monopoly that we have barriers to entry. There is a reason why it's only Sodexo that sells on campus. It's not because it's not profitable for one of you guys to open up a store here on campus to sell food. And there's a reason why only a certain firm could produce and sell beer at a hockey game. It's not because it wouldn't be worthwhile for you to do it. If you could bring beer and sell it there, you would be happy, you would pay for your schooling and other things. But it's because you have barriers to entry. In perfect competition, there is no barriers to entry. So a stable situation has to be a situation where no new entrant wants to enter. And no person within the industry wants to leave. If you think about it, if there was positive economic profits, so before looking at the graphs too much, yeah, incentive to enter / exit. If we had, sorry for my poor handwriting, positive economic profits, what do you think would happen? So again, always throw it in the extreme scenario. You see a friend of yours just started a small business here on campus, and he's driving in a Porsche or whatever else, brand new Porsche. And you see how much money he's making, you see how many clients he's getting, his costs, and he's just making tons of money in a legitimate way. It's not like an illegal business or anything else. Well, what would happen typically?
More people will try and start doing that.
Exactly. More people do the same thing. So this makes more people enter. When more people enter, we're going to see that this will do what to the price of those goods? It's going to drop the price. And we're going to see graphically as well that as price drops, we're going to have economic profits go down. So there'll be a drop in economic profits. It's going to drop until you have zero economic profits. Because even though the economic profits may be small, if there is some and you believe you would have some by entering, you still have an incentive. If you're making $100,000 working for someone else, and you feel that you could leave this job and make $110,000, $120,000 doing your own thing, not working anymore, why not? It doesn't have to be double the salary. It could just be a little bit more. But if you feel that you leave your job and you'd only make $80,000 elsewhere for working the same amount of hours, not really worthwhile anymore. Okay? So you could start from a situation of positive economic profits, and you'll see, even though we haven't done the graphical analysis, that things will drive to a situation where we'll have zero economic profits. And if we started from the other way around as well, I won't write it out just because I'm missing space, but if we started with negative or economic profits, which is that situation that you could still be making money. It's just you're not making as much as your next best alternative. So you're only making 70,000 instead of 100. Well, then in that situation, you would start seeing some people quit this business and go back to their old job. As people quit this business and go back to their old job, it's just all the opposites that would happen. People would leave instead of more people entering. Some of the people within the industry would leave. As those people leave, it's going to have an upward pressure on prices because the few people that remain could start charging more since there's less competition. And as that happens, as prices rise, economic profits will go up till we have that stable situation of zero economic profits. Okay? Any questions with regards to that? Okay. So you could see all of that graphically as well. And like sometimes I'll ask your graphs, but it's very rare that on an exam, and it might be more multiple choice anyways for this exam, but it's very rare on an exam that you're not able to just explain it in words. If you could explain it clearly in words, by all means, if that's the way you want to do it, typically you could get your full marks anyways. It's just graphs typically just paint a picture much more rapidly. It's just a much quicker explanation. But understanding in words and being able to explain it is key to understanding it all. So, this is the stable situation. I'll just kind of very rapidly look at the 3 other situations. And we kind of just talked about this rapidly. I'll just kind of draw 3 sets of graphs. This one's going to be a little squished out. Okay. So, if you wanted to alternate typical firm and market, doesn't really matter. I just like to see them side by side. So all of these for me will be the market, and all of these will be my typical firm. And I could just draw the typical firm curves identical. Oops. In all scenarios, I'll just draw them similar to one another. I'm not talking about changes in costs. I could. It's a little bit more tricky just because all curves would move. So I typically don't ask that question. Okay. So even though they're not perfect, if I had like a computer and I was doing it and I could just kind of like copy paste this thing 3 times. The only thing that's going to be different is the actual supply and demand for this product at a given point in time. Okay. And typically speaking, that situation on an exam could come from, I'll often start an exam if ever I ask this question. I'm not saying it will be on the final, but it might be a version of it. I often start from a situation that I say, you start in a stable situation, stable, long run situation in perfect competition. And that word stable over time or whatever just means that there is no more entrance and exits that happen, that things are kind of stable for now. But stable doesn't mean that it's like set in stone. There could still be market forces that shift things around, but unless there's a big event that changes the demand for this product, or there's a drought, or there's a fire, or there's a bomb, or whatever, things can remain stable. The prices can remain pretty stable over time. Okay? So if I wanted to, I could draw the same graph relationship as I have here on all 3 of these, in the sense that I can start from that stable situation. Okay? I won't do it that way just because I don't want to overcrowd the graph and go away from the meaning, but in reality, you should be able to do it this way. You should be able to start with a graph like this, and then if you want to keep it clear, you could change colors and say, well, all of a sudden there's a drop in demand for this product for da-da-da reason, or all of a sudden there's an increase in the demand for this product for da-da-da reason. And then you can see what the implications are, what will change over time. Okay? At the end of the day, the different scenarios that you're going to have are these. One is that this price that is determined by the market ends up being at the intersection of ATC, MC, and the price curve. Or we can have a situation such as here. Let's say I'll put the price over here. I could have it in between these two curves, or I could have it below these curves. Okay, so I'll just call it, let's say this one here was P1, P2, P3, P4, just to make it different. Okay. So I could either have, for the same graphs, if you had it all on the same graph, it could either be a high price, a mid price, a low price. Those are different prices. And the prices are determined by supply and demand. So in this case here, I could have like a massive drop in supply that leads to an increase in price, or I could have had a big shift in demand rightward that leads to an increase in price. The price there is higher. So I'll just put numbers just to put a scale to it with respect to all the examples. So here you could have $12. Down here you could have like $10. Over here you could have like $8. And then down here you can have like $5. Okay, so like I said, you could have started from this example here with a price of $10 that leads to this outcome, this stable outcome. And you could have had it that for some reason, people now desire this product more than before. People realize that by eating this food, there is no chance of contracting COVID. If there is such a food like avocados, that no way, we tested everyone who contracted COVID and there hasn't been one single person who eats avocados. As soon as you eat it, you're immune. Well, if that would be the case, you can know for sure that there would be a big increase in demand. And with this big increase in demand, we know from chapter 3 that an increase in demand in the situation here, changes the market equilibrium, would lead to an increase in price, and it would lead to this situation here. This is a situation that we have a higher price than the stable situation, the stable outcome. So this is, I'll just kind of state it as a high price scenario. Okay. I'll call this one, it's the first time I put buzzwords on these. I don't know if it's going to help you guys out or not. I'll call this one the stable price, and then I'll call this the, I don't know, low price, and this the very low price. So from a stable situation, something, either an increase in demand or a drop in supply, led to an increase in the price, led to this scenario. Or from the stable situation, you had a drop in demand or an increase in supply that led to a lower price, or an even greater shift that led to an even lower price. Question? I know I have poor writing and graphing. Do you have any questions on anything here? Yeah.
For P3,
Yeah.
it's below ATC, right?
It's below ATC and above AVC where it intersects, yes. Yeah, so that's the big difference here. So one will intersect above ATC and AVC. One intersects where ATC is, so it goes through it. One where it crosses MC is in between the two, and this one where it crosses MC is below both. Yeah. Yeah. So those are the 4 scenarios that we can end up with. So the question that was asked here is actually quite relevant and brings me to another point, which is how do we analyze this in a perfect competition setting, and why did I keep these 3 cost curves and I have this price that's determined? Well, I know that under perfect competition, the price, if you've watched the videos, you should know that the price is equal to marginal revenue, which is also equal to average revenue in all of these cases here. So I could just kind of say the same thing. And what I mean by that is that I don't have my water bottle with me today, but like if I were to sell these erasers under perfect competition, since I'm such a small seller, if I decide to sell 1 more unit, for me to sell 1 more unit, I do not need to change the price. There's this big market involved, and regardless of how much I choose to sell, there's always going to be a buyer to buy it if I sell it at the world or / market price. So if I decide to produce 1 more of these, I can sell it at the market price, which we're going to see is quite different when we look at monopoly. If the people at the Bell Center want to sell more beer on a hockey night, they can't just say, we're going to bring more beer in and it's going to get sold. No, you're the sole seller. You face the whole market. You're not just a small player. If you want to sell more, you're going to have to drop the price. Okay? But in perfect competition, because you're such a small player, if you manage to produce more wheat and to bring it to the wheat board to sell it, you're going to be able to sell it at the market price. And since you're such a small seller, you're not going to be driving the price down individually. Okay? That's the whole idea here. So because of that, the price you receive to selling 1 more is also your marginal revenue. If you can sell this for $5, every time you choose to produce 1 more, your extra revenue, your change in total revenue for an extra unit sold will also be equal to the price. And your average revenue will also be equal to that price as well, because if I sell 100 units at $500, that's $500. When I divide it by 100, I still get $5. So under perfect competition, in perfect competition only, all 3 of these are equal to one another. And some textbooks will refer to this kind of like horizontal curve as the kind of like individual firm level demand curve. Okay? I don't normally call it that way, but that's pretty much the story. And then, so if we ask ourselves, well, why are these cost curves important? Well, the first cost curve that is important is marginal cost. Why? Well, profit, so this, if you see me, I'll use it. I'll write it out first. Profit, which in this class is referred to as the pi sign. If you're also doing macroeconomics with me, the pi sign represents inflation. It's just a lazy way of representing a concept in both classes. So in micro, profit is the pi sign. Well, in profit maximization, we produce up to MC is equal to MR. I'll just write a note, if we produce. So you either produce 0 units, you shut down entirely, or you produce the quantity, so I'll just write quantity, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So if I look at each of these graphs here, in this case here, this is my marginal cost curve, this is my marginal revenue curve. Over here, this is my optimal quantity. A small distinction, you don't have to do this, but a small distinction I make between the market and the typical firm is I could use a big Q for output of all the companies and a small q for my typical firm. It's not required, it's just a distinction I make. Here, this is again my marginal revenue is this horizontal line, and my marginal cost. So this would be my optimal quantity, and it would be over here my optimal quantity. Okay. So why do we stop producing where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost? Always to remember things and to make sense of it. Yes?
I think for that you're not making money on your unit because the formula for marginal cost is your output is not good as it should be.
It's not that it's not as good as it should be, but if I look over here and I say this is the optimal quantity to produce, if I choose to produce, if I look to the right of it, my marginal cost is greater than my marginal revenue. What does marginal cost greater than marginal revenue represent? Well, just add numbers and you'll make sense of it. If my marginal revenue of selling one of these is $5, well, if my marginal cost is greater than my marginal revenue, it would be a situation like to produce this cost me an extra $6. Does it make financial sense to produce something that costs you $6 to produce when you could only sell it for $5? No. But on the other side, if you're somewhere over here where you're not already producing Q star, you're below it, well then over here would be a situation that I could produce and sell this for $5 and my cost of production is $4. Then it makes sense. I should produce that unit. So I keep on producing until the last unit that I produce makes either no profit or like it's the last unit that I produce that can make a small positive contribution to my profit. As soon as my cost on that extra unit is greater than my revenue on that extra unit, don't produce it. So that is the purpose of the marginal cost curve. So it determines the optimal quantity to produce. This is what we're looking for, the quantity. The second cost curve that we're going to look at is ATC. This will determine economic profits or losses, or zero economic profits. Okay. So, economic profits or losses. For us to determine profits or losses, we need to look at the relationship between average total cost and the price that we obtain for the specific amount of units we produce. Okay? So as soon as we've kind of set up this graph, the thing that can be complicated or hard to grasp sometimes when people look at this graph is they look at the whole picture where you have to really just zone in onto a very specific part of the picture when you answer this question. And the very specific part of the picture, if I'm looking at this picture here, like these cost curves, this whole range here is kind of irrelevant to me. I've established that this is my optimal quantity to produce. What's relevant at that point is for this specific quantity, this is the quantity I produce, what is my revenue on that unit, and what is my cost per unit on average for producing those units. And that's what the average total cost serves. We mentioned this before. The average total cost is a measure of the cost per unit on average. So if I produce 1,000 of these and I have a bunch of different costs from the infrastructure involved, from the machinery, from the workers that I hire, I put all those costs together and I divide it by the amount of units I sold. That is my average total cost. That is my cost per unit, embedding everything, not just the materials, not just the workers I hired, everything. So average total cost, that's what it represents. So if I produce 1,000 units at $5, I know my revenues are 5,000. I have to wonder, well, are my costs greater or less than 5,000? And if my cost per unit is less than $5, it means that my costs are less than 5,000. If it's more, it's greater. So here, I'm really focused on revenue and cost per unit. AVC is not cost per unit. It's only the variable cost portion per unit. ATC is average total cost. So it's embedding all the costs. So I'm interested in this point here. I'm interested in this point here. I'm interested in this distance between the two and the amount of units that I produce. This rectangle here represents, in this case, my profits or losses. And in this case here, am I dealing with economic profits or economic losses?
It's a loss.
It's a loss because my cost per unit is greater than my revenue per unit, my average revenue or my price. So I'm selling this on for a cost of $6 on average, and I only get $5 for it. So this is a loss. I'll just write it as the pi sign is smaller than 0. That's a very quick way of writing that this is a loss. But I'd invite you to do the same procedure here to establish profits or losses on the first graph. Because that's the one that when we go to draw it, people make the most mistake on. And once again, drawing mistakes is not the end of the world, but drawing mistakes I'm picky on when they kind of alter the reality. That means that you don't really understand it too well. So here, once again, I look at the quantity I produce. For that quantity, I find my price, I find my cost per unit. It's this vertical distance, and then I go across, and this should be a perfect rectangle. The mistake I often see is that some people kind of go down to this bottom portion here, include part of that as well. It's not a perfect rectangle. They do something weird. So keep in mind that the profit or losses area, a profit area, is always a rectangle. If it has a curved area to it, it doesn't work. You have that vertical distance. So the vertical distance is your profit or loss per unit. Profit or loss per unit. And the horizontal distance is the number of units. It's your Q star that you obtained in part 1. Whereas where we have marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Okay. Okay. So, out of these 4 graphs, you would stop there and like 2 of the scenarios, just looking at MC and ATC is sufficient. Where you want to go, the third step and require the AVC is if you have negative profits. Then you want to look at the relationship here with AVC. So AVC is only if you have negative profits. If you're making positive profits, you don't care about this as much. You don't really care about it, actually. But if you have negative profits, you're going to ask yourself this relationship with average variable cost. And this relationship that you're going to ask yourself, so the 2 places here where we have losses, here we're making positive profits. I forgot to ask you this. Here, 0 economic profits. Here we're making losses. And here we're making even bigger losses. In these 2 categories, you have one more question to ask yourself. If we have negative profits, are we covering variable costs? Which means, is price greater than average variable costs at Q star, or is price smaller than average variable costs at Q star? So if you have any questions as we go, ask me. Sometimes when I write this out, just because I want to write it as concise as possible, I get technical with my jargon, but it's very easy to bring it back to a easier to understand framework with just plain old words. Okay. So here, if I think about these two scenarios, and you look at these two scenarios, graphically speaking, if I were to give you a bunch of different graphs and say, tell me in which of these two graph combinations you have a situation where you're not even covering your variable costs, it should be obvious in which of these it is. It should be in one of these two, and then it should be quite obvious. Well, the one that it is when you look at this Q star, this price curve lies below the AVC curve at that Q star. Here AVC is below it, here AVC is above it. Since your variable costs on average are greater than your price, you are not covering your variable costs. Okay. So why is this important? We had this discussion when we were talking about in chapter 7. So it should be clear, but let's just come back, go down memory lane once more. Why is the concept of covering variable costs or not a very important concept? And it deals with sunk costs, fixed costs, and everything else. Yes?
Should you stay in business?
In both cases, the answer is, what? If you're losing money, should you stay in business?
Depends on where it is, doesn't it?
It depends, but in all kind of situations, if you're used to earning $100,000 a year and you start a business and you're making 60, you're probably better off if you don't think your business can grow. You're going back to your old job if you have the same satisfaction in terms of job satisfaction and everything else. So in all cases, if you're losing money, you should go back to your old job. There is a distinction, though, between these two situations of losing money. And we talked about this concept in Chapter 7 with different costs. We said there's the idea that you should do this or that depending on your losses. What was the important thing to keep in mind to say, like, you have a coffee shop, should you shut down shop today or should you stay open an extra day? What was that main thing that we had to consider, whether it was worthwhile to stay open one more day or to shut down everything, put the key in the door and just shut it down completely? In both situations, you could be losing money over the course of the whole year or not making as much as for working for someone else. But why would you say, if I had a coffee shop, I had a lease, I have the location, I have all the machinery, and I say, I'm not opening this Saturday? Why would I do that? Yeah? So the fixed costs are the ones you actually want to ignore in this scenario. So what do you have to keep in mind to decide, should I open on Saturday?
Well, if at least your revenue you're generating at least covers your variable cost.
Exactly. So this is the big key point that you had to remember is, are you at least covering your variable costs? If you're covering your variable costs, it's the situation that you decide, I'm going to stay open an extra day. I have to pay 2 workers. That's like, I don't know, $300 worth of salary. I have a little bit more electricity, a little bit more coffee beans to order and everything else. Overall, my costs are maybe like $350, $400 for the day. But there's going to be $600 coming in of sales of coffee. That $600 is not sufficient to pay my rent for that day or the month. It's not sufficient to pay my insurance, all my other fees. So on net, I'm not making as much money as if I was working for someone else, but I should still stay in operation a little longer because I'm covering my variable costs, and because I'm covering my variable costs, my overall bottom line for the whole year will be better if I stay in operation just a little bit longer. If I decide to shut down immediately, I'm losing out on positive days, we can say, like on good days. So this is a situation where overall, I'm not making as much money as if I was working for someone else. So I should shut down, but I should shut down when it is time for my fixed costs to be renewed, when it's time to renew my lease, when it's time to renew anything that is very costly. And if I decide to shut down tomorrow, I'm losing on it. I've kind of prepaid in a bunch of categories. Because I've prepaid, it makes sense for me to stay in operation longer, but at some point when I have to renew those commitments, I don't. So this scenario here is shut down later. So I'll just write SD, shut down later. And if you're not covering your variable costs, shut down now. Because that situation, you have a worker working for you, and it's costing you $400 to open up your coffee shop on Saturday, and you get 5 clients, 5 coffees worth $5 each. You get $25 of revenue for $400 of costs. There is no reason why you should stay in operation. Okay? If you're looking at staying in operation for that one extra day. Unless you're kind of investing and you're kind of like, this is the brand that you're trying to create, you're kind of like, we're open 24/7 and some hours are maybe not as lucrative for you, but because of that 24/7 framework, you still attract clients. That's a different scenario. But if you're asking yourself, I have a coffee shop, I'm not doing too well compared to what I was expecting, should I shut down right away or stay in operation? It should be based on that. Same kind of thing as if you have a yoga studio and you're like, I need to pay my yoga instructor $40 for this hour that they're working, and I only have like 3 clients at $10 a pop. You're not making money. If you have 5 or more, at least you're able to cover that extra salary and maybe the heating like a hot yoga studio or whatever else. So you have to consider that. If you can at least cover your variable costs, it makes sense to stay in operation a little bit longer. That doesn't mean that you'll stay in operation indefinitely if you're still losing money compared to your next best alternative. Okay? So those are the 4 big categories in this whole discussion. You can always start from a situation of a stable situation and then a news event happens. Stable situation, and if you think about it, a stable situation is a situation where even if we're not thinking perfect competition all the time, because yoga studios obviously have a certain brand loyalty and differentiation, but if you think about that as perfect competition, well, any time that you'll have a business, there'll always be kind of a stabilizing point. As soon as there's a new trend, like let's say vegan food is the new trend or something else, and then you have like one restaurant that opens, does very well, you'll have other entrants come in, but at some point it's going to stabilize itself. Coffee shops or whatever else, like we didn't have good coffee when I was here as a student, and now there is. And then there's a few that open, and now we're kind of hitting a stable situation again. They might grow more, but it's just kind of the market's getting more saturated now. And that's what we talk about. So a saturated, stable market is this kind of situation. But if all of a sudden we hear about health benefits of coffee, preventing COVID or whatever, well, obviously something's going to move. There's going to be a shift in demand due to that. It's going to increase price. And as that happens, it's going to start switching the whole kind of relationship between the amount of people in business, and there's going to be an incentive for new people to enter. Okay? So this market structure that we're looking at here could be seen as limiting because it's very rare that we have an infinite amount of buyers and sellers. But you could kind of characterize a bunch of industries that you are one of the sellers and you don't really differentiate yourself in terms of product and you don't really have any market power on the price, would face some level of perfect competition. Like if I'm hiring like a construction worker and it's like, let's say the Quebec government that sets the price that you have to pay for a construction worker, and they all kind of do a similar job and so on, well, they're going to follow this kind of framework. If there's a lot of money being made, more people will enter, it might have an influence on the price and so on. So there's different things that can happen, excavation or whatever. But as soon as there's going to be differentiation, that we're talking about branding or we're talking that this worker is really good versus this worker, Then we're going to be dealing with monopolistic competition, some level of differentiation. As soon as you could find a way to control the whole market on your own, we're going to be talking about monopoly. And when we're dealing with identical products, but just a few amount of sellers, where how much Labatt charges for beer has a big impact on Molson's profits, or other brands of beers, Coke and Pepsi, or different gas stations. If one decides to drop their price and the other one does nothing, it's going to have a big influence on their own profits and their competitors' profits. That's when we're going to be talking about oligopoly. Okay? So if you start a business, you do not choose which one you're in. And if you start a business, it may start as a monopoly, but you have to find a way to keep it as a monopoly. What I mean by that is, if there is no type of restaurant or service like the one you want to offer in a certain area of the country, you might think, I'm going to start it and I'm going to make a lot of money and I'll be the only one doing this. But if people see you making money, other people will enter. So you might start as a monopoly, but you may not remain a monopoly. And the only way that you can do well, not the only way, but one of the ways you want to do well in that industry is that you need to have a certain level of brand recognition, and that people are attracted to come and see you. That someone else that's just coming in afterwards and you did all the heavy lifting in terms of like trying to create this product, trying to create a desire for the service, and you've added a lot of advertising in the process, and this person comes in and just offers a slightly lower price and takes away all the market, is not a good situation. So it's things like that that you have to consider. I remember when I was way younger, I went to Chicoutimi to see a friend, and there was like an aerial park over there, and I was like, this is amazing, and I wanted to start one. I used to work at the paintball place in Mansonville, which doesn't really exist anymore, and I wanted to have like an aerial park / paintball place. And I was like, this is going to work well. I'm the only one that's offering this service, like less than 4-hour drive from here. But in reality, a few years after, like there was like so many aerial parks in the area. Like Sutton had one, Eastman had one, in different areas. So my idea and the profit and everything else, how I evaluated it, was worthy for a certain amount of time. But once you consider all the new entrants afterwards, it's not as a desirable thing. So always making sure that when you consider something that might be very lucrative, you think, try to find a way that prevent other people from enjoying this lucrative thing and bringing down the lucrative level of it afterwards is the key thing here. Any questions with regards to this whole chapter? So this chapter was a little bit more graph and discussion intensive in terms of the theory. If you understand this chapter well, the other ones will be much more simple and will be more applied. So I'll leave you guys to it. I'll see you guys next week. If you have any questions, just come and see me.